Welcome to Radio Times. Kimberly Ray Miller didn't know the word hoarding until she was a senior in high school, even though her father was a longtime hoarder. The houses they lived in were filled with old furniture and boxes, papers, and trash that became breeding grounds for fleas and rats. There was so much stuff they couldn't open doors or use the kitchen. They didn't even know that someone had been secretly living in their attic. But from the outside, they looked like everyone else's family. But Kimberly didn't invite friends over and made sure if another parent drove her home, they dropped her off at someone else's house. She was ashamed of how she lived and kept it a secret. She's now gone public and written a memoir titled Coming Clean. She says she wants to humanize hoarders like her father and give children of hoarders a voice. And Kimberly Ray Miller, nice to have you with us on Radio Times.
Thank you so much for having me.
Do you also want to correct some of these reality shows that have been shown on TV about hoarders?
Well, I'm grateful for those shows in one sense because they've brought attention to this illness that has been for so long in the shadows, and with awareness comes treatment and comes more professionals trained in this area, as well as more dialogue from people who did live through it. But I also worry that we get an unfair perspective of what life is like for a hoarder. These are people who apply to be on a TV show. They need help, and they're desperate for help. And we see them really in a very stressful situation, sort of living out their worst nightmare, and we're watching it on television. So,
well, I have to say, I for a time had watched some of those shows just because I was so both intrigued and bothered, upset, and always identified with the children. Because you saw children trying to sort of hold their family together, both frustrated with their parents, but clearly loving their parents.
Yeah, it's a really hard situation for children, and I think it forces a lot of them to grow up far too soon and take on parental roles.
This is a hard book to write.
It was absolutely. It was really heartbreaking for everyone, for me, for my parents. We all had to relive it, and it was freeing in a lot of ways too.
Is that in part why you wanted to write the book? I mean, to both tell us about children of hoarders, but also to help free yourself, perhaps?
Yeah. I say in the book that I didn't forget. I just simply decided not to remember. For many years, I just put the images of my childhood away. And in writing this book, I really had to come to terms with the fact that all of this really did happen. And I did have feelings towards it. I was angry at the way I was raised. But being angry didn't mean that there wasn't room for love in my family, and I couldn't accept my parents for having a mental illness, but also doing the best they could in everything else.
Now, your dad really was a hoarder.
Yes, absolutely.
Hoarded papers, stuff.
Right. It started with papers and radios, and then over the years sort of grew into anything, things that were broken, things that were cheap, things that he could find some sort of meaning in and use for.
And meaning because at some point he thought maybe I might need this, I might want to use it. I remember this from my childhood, something like that?
Absolutely, but also things that he connected with that were reminders of me or of my mother or of someone he once knew that brought comfort to him. And so I think there's a huge emotional aspect for a lot of people in what they collect.
And how about your mom?
I separate my mom as a compulsive shopper because the pathology is different. My mom shops out of boredom, and it does get out of hand at times, but she also doesn't have the same emotional connection to things. We can throw out the stuff as soon as it comes in. It's not an emotional aspect for her. So it certainly enabled my father. It certainly added to the mess, but I do believe there's a difference between compulsive shopping and hoarding.
But the idea is that she would shop, I guess, online.
Yeah.
Packages would arrive, but she might never wear the clothes, for instance.
Well, for a good portion of my childhood, my mother was bedridden from disability, and after the disability healed, she was still so depressed because of the failed surgeries and the way her body was later formed.